What up, everybody? Scuff D here, and today I'm going to talk about control decks. Let's see if I can shrink this down just a smidge. Come on now, it doesn't need to be that big. We were doing card openings before, crate openings, so a little bit bigger view, facial expressions, reactions, but that's all past us. That epic is beyond us, and I am back to recouping and recovering gold. So I got a bevy of topics to talk about. Number one, we've got Thousand Suns, we've got Custodes, we've got a new event, I've got new deck strategies going on here, I've got new deck building concepts. But before we get into any of that, I want to revisit and continue on with my series in terms of just kind of talking about game terms or deck design basics. Last time I discussed aggro decks. Aggro is probably the easiest to identify, the easiest to give examples of, and probably the most popular in terms of speed of play. What I want to talk about today is control. Control is probably as close to the opposite as you can get from aggro, but that doesn't necessarily mean always that control is slow. Control can come in many different forms. The Death Guard do it via board control in degrees of poison, in degrees of healthy troops, increasing the health of troops, increasing the health of their warlord, multiple frontline units. They do board control. Typhon and Mortarion excel in that, and they are much more of a longer game. You've got Alpha Legion, who does more of a control. It's very a focus control in the terms that it does stunning, a lot of stunning, specific stunnings, but targeted, not necessarily removal, but manipulation, which is a deviation or a subgenre of control, as is in degrees with their orders, traps and whatnot, energy denial, resource denial, giving you too many cards in your hand, too few resources to play, stunning what you put in play, making you second guess what you put into play. That is a different type of control, but it is control just the same. It frustrates you. It is basically it's a counterplay style. In the same way, one more. Let's see here. Try to think of another good. Board control. When we're talking about the opposite of board control, we've got Death Guard, who build a board, who do control. Probably none are better in terms of board control than the Sons of Horus. They have the option, especially if you're doing like an old school Abaddon, but Abaddon, Iron Hands. Santar is a perfect example of a board control deck. He's got the ability to do damage to troops that are on the board, hold out for a certain point within the game where the momentum begins to slip from the player who is dumping everything, trying to establish some sort of presence, and all Santar has to do is play the right cards at the right time. Once he is able to lock in 2 servo arms, he can heal, do some damage. Anything that gets really nasty towards the end of the game, he can play Captured Forge for reduced cost and Fall of Gardenal to clear board. It's a different kind of board control. It's basically denial board denial control. That's how I would explain it. There are a lot of sub factors. Some legions do it better than others. Some legions just don't do it at all. I don't think War Leaders, Dar is probably the closest thing you're going to get to some sort of board denial, but their cards just do not factor into control denying resources. They factor into straight damage. Raven Guard factor into denying you the ability to do anything to them, but I would not put them as a control. They have a different build. It's definitely not it's not aggro. It's very much more of a combo. They are a combo legion. Thousand Suns is a combo legion. We'll talk about Thousand Suns when we get to Thousand Suns card by card, but in terms of combo versus control, you could have a combination of control / X, control / direct damage, control / stun, control / denial, control / whatever. Combo is combo. Combo means you're banking on 2 or 3 specific interactions within your deck to devastating results, basically. And anybody who's experienced the Thousand Suns as of late, double Octo, repeat Witchfires, the term that has been since changed now, but I think it's still viable and not as nearly as where it was. Assyrian and Lash, that is a combo. It's a killer. It's a killer combo. They are a combo style, so I would not necessarily put them in terms of control. What are Space Wolves? I think Space Wolves are mid-range aggro. I don't think they fall into control. I don't think they're quite full aggro. They've got stats to do it if they want to, but they don't play quickly in that regard. But control is basically just denying your opponent something, forcing them into a position to either where the point where they've spent all their resources playing as much as they can to try to get past you, or to the point where you establish a certain point in your deck. Like I said, with the Iron Hands, the Santar deck is a perfect example of that. At some point, if you have the right cards, you've got the right things on your Warlord, you are now in a position where your momentum will far exceed your opponent's momentum. The Alpha Legion's control is much more based off of frustration of your opponent, limiting what are they going to do with what cards they have in hand, maybe knowing that you've got some copies of those cards and they're really trying to beat you to a certain punch, but if they can't, and you're able to pull off a harrowing and they've got a huge hand, if they can't get past that point, the advantage still falls within the control player. The Death Guard, their control option is basically, whittle you down to you don't have as many board troops as possible or damage options as possible, and then they have the Death Shroud, and the Death Shroud isn't going anywhere. Mortarion can stun you all he wants. You've played all your troops, you're just playing top deck and you don't have anything. You've just got a lone Warlord who's getting stunned and getting Death Shrouded. There's nothing you can do. That's a very long game example of what control does. Within the confines of this game, I would say those are all definitions of how control operates. Now, down the road, we might see control come up with some. I would definitely think Imperial Fist could be a legion that does control builds. It's very possible. I could see Dark Angels doing something like that. But how they do it remains to be seen. That's in the future. But as the game state as it is currently now. So when you hear that term, that's what you should be thinking. It's not a deck that necessarily gets right in my face right away, but it is a deck that I have to be ahead of at a certain point, or I am in a disadvantage at that point going forward. If you have 5+ cards in your hand at turn 4 with Alpha Legion, you're in a precarious position. If you have 6 or 7+ cards, that's not a good place that you want to be. Conversely, with Iron Hands, that's not a bad place to be, because it still means you have lots of options to what he has on his table, and you want him to have less. Iron Hands definitely have less options to draw cards. So if you can stay above him, you have more options than what he's got. He may be able to heal his Warlord several times, but if he's played his 2 Winnows, and you still have the ability to put troops on the table, you are now ahead of him. If they have more than 4 health, he can't play that Fall of Gardenal with maximum success. You are now ahead of him. So these are ways that you stay ahead, knowing what your opponent has and knowing specifically how best to play it. With Death Guard, if you have the ability to ignore their front line, or you have the ability to deny their front line, or most importantly, can just beat them to death before they can drop their 2 endurances and their Death Shroud, you can beat their long game. It just depends on who you're facing. Now, how you do that, it's all relevant to what your deck is. Are you an aggro deck? Then you've got to go fast. If you're an aggro deck against Alpha Legion, they might not necessarily want to give you more cards. They might try it as a gamble, but at the same time, them giving you more cards, that's kind of your advantage that you have. It's not something that they want to do. That was something with Garrow when he was prior to his nerf against Alpha Legion. You didn't want to give Garrow cards. You still kind of don't, because his ability really hasn't changed. It's just his starting card count has. But he can aggro very fast. So he's not he has a natural counterplay, basically, to that specific control build. However, Garrow versus an Iron Hands build, he still has an advantage because he has the speed as an aggro player. But if the Iron Hands is able to fire everything on key and on point, and get some frontline and denial out, and Garrow runs out of cards, it's possible that the Iron Hands could eke out that game, but I don't know. I think just naturally, I think Garrow has a high chance to do that on his own. That's just me speculating right now. So how do you beat control? It really depends on what your deck is, and how many cards you've got to get to their point, what their deck is. It's a very specific matchup. With aggro, you can go at all sorts of different ways, frustrate them, deny them. It depends on your build. Healing, knowing what their maximum damage output is, and just staying outside that level or denying their ability to hit you with it, be a front line or now precognition or even ward to some degree. But with control, it's very specific. How does this warlord match up against another? For instance, Kurz playing against against Santar. I can do it. You can do it. It's not hard, but you need a couple cards to trigger faster than he needs his stuff. You need your Mercy and Forgiveness. You need probably a couple of the right stealth cards, and you definitely need to have your Reapers and your Raven on hand and not ready to go. And you've just got to stay healthy, and that's how you do it. It's tricky, and then to go with that, it helps if he doesn't have his servo harnesses and his massive heal, and he doesn't play frontline right when you don't want him to. But there's ways to work around that. Versus, same matchup, Santar versus gosh, I'm just trying to think of another control warlord. Santar versus I would almost say Mandragorax has the potential to be a control warlord because he's a board denial. You can build him as pure board denial. It's a fun boy to play him. I would venture to say that he can be a control warlord. He's not specifically, but he has the option to. However, in that matchup, Santar versus Mandro, Mandro needs cards in hand, and they need to be high damaging cards. And if you fall at a point, you need to consistently pump out that damage against Santar, and hope that he doesn't get his healing. And that's really more of a luck on luck. What are you going to get? Can you do more before he gets more? If you can get the Manifest Destiny and he's not able to heal, you have an edge, because a lot of his stuff is going to be board denial. You don't have a board, you're able to do direct damage. We've got new cards now, though. So how does this change things? Imperial Edict is a huge tool for control in terms of denying certain builds. If you build it that way, you can just jank a tactic deck. Malkador's Observer could potentially be, and then you've got Orbital Bombardment. I mean, just putting one Orbital Bombardment in a Mandro deck could be enough to shake up the game at the end of the game, and then that would help him leap past that curb if he's playing against a Santar who doesn't have other troops on table. So yeah, it just depends. It's very specific on the specific matchup. Control is much more of a thinking man's style, and it's not an insult to aggro. But if you enjoy being in a position of advantage and knowing this is what I have to do to stay in advantage, and knowing, okay, at this point, this is where I'm now in a position to potentially lose this game. Aggro is very obvious. Aggro is like, oh man, I'm not drawing the cards I need, and I'm just getting beat. I'm not doing more damage than I'm taking damage. It's very straightforward. A control deck can very quickly turn from looking like a loss into locking in a win, because they know that, okay, we're still in a good position. We can take this much damage. But at this point, if I have these 3 cards in play or in my hand, I have the ability to lock out what he can put on table, or lock out his ability to finish off the game in certain matchups. Alpha Legion knows if they can get Saboteur Squad on point, on curve, and play those on turn 2 and turn 3, they're in a huge position. They've denied you resources, and then at that point, anything else that they give you, whether it's card drawing, playing on turn 4 Sirius Squad with a Ghost Legionary, they're giving you more cards, you have less resource, and then on top of that, anything else that you're dealing, you can only pay 2 points less to throw out there. Or just being in a better position to use the harrowing at late game. They know that they have got an edge, and they need to take advantage of that before you reach back up to full 10 energy and catch up to them. So then it becomes a race, but they're in a position where if they built their deck right, they should be running that race fairly well. So it's really, yeah, it really is more of a style played from if you like to be in that position or know where your position is, as opposed to sometimes lucking into a win, and that can happen in any game, but Karn does that more often than probably any other warlord, just because of his random pings, and he could say, all right, I pulled it off, I won. Okay, well, did you plan it that way? No. Control definitely plans their wins, and that is a big difference. That's not, I mean, aggro plans in the way their deck does it to throw out as much damage as possible, but control is much more deliberate plays. Whether that's deliberate plays to shut out what the opponent is doing because they recognize the threat, or they can ignore certain threats because they realize that that card is not going to do anything to me that I have to worry about. Or if it's because they shut you out and you can't even get to play those cards that you want to play. Duke Mortimer is a great example. I mean, if you can get Duke in any deck that's able to keep him on table and doesn't use him as a attacking troop, his ability to toss cards back up to hand, whether that's yours or theirs, primarily theirs, that's board denial. That's control, and that's why he becomes a target. Lucking him into him with an abundance of supplies and being able to play him on second turn is just nasty. It makes people sad and puts you in a huge advantage for that reason, for that style. That's what he does. But he doesn't go in every deck. Duke doesn't belong in every deck, but if your deck tends to play from behind the lines or from, thwarting what your opponent is doing, then he ties into that style. And the more things that you do that thwart your opponent's own plays, the more you lean towards that control element. So that is control. That is it. I mean, there's not a whole lot to it, but when you hear aggro, when you hear control, mid-range combo, it's sometimes, if you're not familiar with card games, it's good to think about that. If you're familiar with card games, sometimes it's good to picture it, how it applies to Horus Heresy Legions, and that's how I feel it applies here. I could be wrong. Let me know your thoughts. If you've got your own opinions, if you've got certain warlords that you feel definitely fit into this style, into the control style that I didn't talk about, throw them out there, because there definitely are. And I do think some that people might consider aggro could be control. We haven't even talked about the Custodes yet. Where do they fit in? I've talked about Nassau in a different video, but in terms of Saipa, gosh, I don't know. They could go a couple different ways. I think I don't know yet. That's a whole different ball of wax. So, anyways, guys, that's it. That's what I want to talk about. Next, I'll probably talk about I guess we'll talk about combo or mid-range, which are the next two styles. And we definitely have some examples of that. This game definitely has some examples of that. So that's it. That's what I've got. And hopefully that's a little bit informative for you. If it isn't, then you're probably already familiar enough with card games that shouldn't surprise you. But just to give it some different perspective and look at your deck differently. When you're building a deck, or if you're playing the same deck repeatedly, at what point are you losing the game every time? At what point are you winning the game every time? And is it every matchup? And if it is, those are the points that you need to look into, either A, deck construction, or B, what plays specifically in that matchup could you have done differently to win? And that's really where the line is between aggro and control. The control is wrong play, misplay for sure. Misplay from 2 turns ago is what cost you the game, as opposed to aggro, which could be a misplay that cost you the game, but it was that turn. So it really just depends, and there's a fine line there. But once you cross the line, it's very visible in terms of how your play style is, and if that is your style, if you feel that you're a control player, there are options for you out there. If you haven't dived into them yet and you've been limited to playing some games because they go fast, that's true. The control decks play a few more minutes longer, but they're worth it, and they don't have to be 10-minute games. There are definitely control decks that can operate within 5 to 7 minutes, and that might be too much for some people, but for me that's completely realistic. So it's not like it's a 60-minute match at a table at a tournament, or a 30-minute match even. I mean, we're talking 5 to 10 minutes here. That's completely doable. So, all right, guys, that's it for me. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this information is useful to you, and keep playing Legions. Hey, guys, really quick, one more thing before I forget. The second Legion second founding tournament is coming up. I've been trying to hype up the Lodge Wars 3 tournament and the Global, and it's on Discord. If you're not on Discord, again, go to Discord. But the second founding tournament is going to start, I believe, next week. It's going to be a weekly series, I believe. Iron Duke is the one that's running it. And if you are a newer or lower level player, and you have legendary points, I believe it's below, I don't know the minimum, I'm sorry, I believe it's below 2,000 legendary points. It might be below 5,000, but it's if you don't have any, or you have up to 2,000, check out Discord. It's a tournament designed for you. It's a tournament designed for those level of players who aren't always in high-level Terra, who don't have a huge amount of legendary points, but who still want to play tournaments, who still want to have an opportunity to win or play against people at their same level. And they run those weekly. They're going to be starting them up next week. Signups are on Discord. Keep an eye out on that. As I get more information specifically as far as when they start, I will let you know. We also have got the Lodge Wars 3 tournament. Signups end in... It's the 23rd. Signups end in a week. This is the last 7 days to get your Lodge team signed up for Lodge Wars 3. First place team wins a Primarch of their choice as well as gold. And gold is nice. And in addition to that, keep an eye out for weekly tournaments, for Legends tournaments, the Horus Heresy Legends tournaments, which is the opposite of the second founding. It's basically for the higher level folks with 16,000 plus legendary points. And then we've also got a couple other formats in there. King of the Hill. If you want to play the game against some players who also want to play the game and you're tired of facing bots in practice, or ladder, or just playing event games and getting eke out of it, you can get prizes, you can get stuff. Go on Discord, check it out. I forgot to mention that in my last video. I want to make sure I plug that up in here. I'm going to try to keep plugging that away because we've got a lot of people who are good players who are interested in it, and the more players who come and join, the better. So please check it out. Again, you do have to be on Discord to sign up for it. Make sure you get in there though, because it's worth it. It's worth it not just for the tournaments, but for the whole experience and for the player connections. But yeah, so that's it. All right.
All right, that wraps it up for me. If you liked what you saw, feel free to like and subscribe. Add any comments below. And if you think the video might be useful or the series might be useful, feel free to share that with other players that you know as well. And we'll talk to you later.